I'm telling the story because it fits a little. It fits enough. I'm a shtickle Rabbi in a shul in Crown Heights. It's called Beis Shimshon. And one of the zechusim that we have is that Rabbi Newman from Long Beach, David Newman, when he comes to Crown Heights, davens with us because his son-in-law is a member of our shul. So he had a number of fabrengens, and he told special stories. The kind of special stories that you have to remember, and I don't remember them all. I certainly don't remember all the names. But one of the special stories that he told us was the following story, that he knew a Yid who was in America since the turn of the last century, and before, maybe, I don't know when he came here, who went into the Friedrich Rebbe. He lived in Boston. Rabbi Newman grew up in Boston. So I don't know where this Yid lived. I'm assuming he lived someplace in Massachusetts. He went into the previous Rebbe, that means 75 years ago or more, and he said to the Friedrich Rebbe a story from someone that he knew from 30 years ago. In other words, from 100 years ago, 100 or more even. That there was a mishpoche that came from Europe who, how did they make a parnasa? They used to go out and collect grass, hay in the spring, whatever they collected, some kind of a growth that grows naturally, and they would bring it into their house, and they would weave out of it mats and baskets and other kind of useful things that you make from thatch, from straw that later hardens and it becomes. So in the spring they would collect the straw, they would weave these baskets, they'd put them on the roof to dry in the summer, and then they would sell it, and they had parnasa from this all year. Wow. Not that they had a lot of parnasa, but this is all they had. So one of the children wakes up in the middle of the night and sees a very strange sight. His mother is standing in the entrance to the house. The door's open. And when she sees him, she motions to the child to be quiet. And the child says, "Why should I be quiet?" He says, "Shh. Father's not allowed to wake up." What was going on? A man came to steal all of these baskets, which would mean that the family would starve. In America in those days, it was Pashit Norach Monas. What was the problem? The man driving the wagon, not the Ganef, the accomplice, had two daughters who need to make a shidduch. If her husband would call the police, and it would be found out that this person is an accomplice to a Ganef, his daughter is not permitted to make a shidduch. The husband woke up, and she refused to let him out the front door. Oh. She didn't want him to see who it was. She didn't want him to see who it was. Oh. Now, how this family lived that year, I don't know. But this is the story that he told the Friedrich Rebbe. Wow. And the Friedrich Rebbe answered him, "Mir leben von Zeres Chusim." We live from their Chusim.
Yeah. What a level.
Yeah, what a level. I'm looking at it. What a level. You know the story. The famous joke about a king who was always depressed. So his advisor said that he has to find the happiest man in the kingdom and to put on his shirt and he'll be happy. So he found him. He said, I don't have a shirt. Oh, God. Okay, Rabbi, we're in Tanya. Yeah, it's already 11 o'clock. It's very late. Yeah. Okay, we're talking about, I'm using words which are not exact, but it's just the shortest way to get to the point, okay? We're near the end of Perikid Beis, the end of chapter 12. We're on page Yudzayin Beis, page 34. I'm not sure exactly where we're starting, but that's where we're holding. The language that we're using, and again, I'm conceding that this is not necessarily exact, it's just helpful, is the word hirhur versus machshava. When it comes to hirhur aveda, the Alter Rebbe brings the Lashon HaGemara, hirhuri aveda kosheme aveda, which means hirhur is not an aveda. Hirhur means a thought, fleeting thought, which is not a sin. So you have hirhuri aveda and machshava zaras, right? You have thoughts of aveda and sins that are sinful. That's how you would, I guess, translate it, yeah? The difference between hirhur aveda and machshava zara is that machshava zara is an actual aveda. Machshava zara is an actual aveda. And the hirhur aveda is not an Aveda, it's just something that I suppose a person cannot control, and the Gemara says even though it's not an Aveda, it's kosher me Aveda, it's harder than Aveda, it could be worse than an Aveda, and so on. So, last week we talked about this, and I'm not going to repeat all of last week's class, I'm just going to sort of set the stage, that what is a Hirud Aveda? Hirud Aveda means a thought enters into my mind, right? We all have a subconscious, we all have a pneumius, and depending on our level and who we are, our pneumius is either not so good or better or even better. And on that basis, there's ideas that emerge from the subconscious to the consciousness, from the pneumius and neshama to the chitzonius and neshama, that we really have no control over, right? So when a bad thought enters into our consciousness, it's not an Aveda because we cannot control it. So it's not called a machshava zara, it's called the hirud aveda. It's not called a bad thought, which would constitute a sin, it's called the hirud aveda. It's called the, let's use this word, it's a fantasy of an aveda. So we're going to do this backwards. Let's talk about machshava zaras first. Okay, what is a thought which is considered a sin? The way you learn this in Tanya, there's two types of machshavas zaras which are considered an actual aveda. The first is if a person gets a hirur, gets a fantasy, gets a thought from a subconscious to his consciousness which is not appropriate, and he prolongs it. He doesn't push it out, he prolongs it. So if I get a thought I'm not supposed to have of any sort, and instead of pushing it out, I prolong it, that's an Aveda. That's number one. And then there's number two. I have a thought that comes from my subconscious to my consciousness, and I think about doing it practically. They're two different things. Number one, if I prolong, again, I'm using this word for lack of words. If I prolong the fantasy, I prolong what comes from my subconscious to my consciousness, that's an Aveda. And number two, if I think about doing the Aveda practically, actionably, that's also considered an Aveda. Now here's how this plays out in philosophy, in practice. The way it plays out in philosophy is this. I've been discussing with you for weeks now that the Nefesh HaBahamis has a teva. One of the things that's come up in our classes is that when the Alter Rebbe says that a Beinani, not during davening, was he uninspired, wins every fight. Yeah, a Beinani, when he's davening, he's a melech, right? I have to say that, mandatory. Melech and Meluch, if it's Melech and Moshe, it's not Perikid Beis, yeah? When he's davening, he's a melech. When he's not davening, he's a Moshe, or a Shalat. How does he win every time? So now I'm going to use different words. I'm saying the same thing I said, I believe, for the last 2-3 weeks, but I'll say it in different words. The magic word is teva. Magic word is teva. The magic word is teva. Teva. A person not when he's off, when he's not in a state of melucha, when he's in a state of memshala, wins the fight against the other every time because of his teva. You see, but there's two tevas here. There's two tevas, and the way it works out is that the Alter Rebbe gives two ideas. One has to do with the first concept of teva, and the other has to do with the second concept of teva. What's the difference between the first concept of teva and the second concept of teva? The first concept of teva is the teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis. The second concept of teva is the teva of the Nefesh HaLakis. Moyach shalta aleh b'toldase v'tevi yitzirasa is the teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis. The way I explained it to you, this idea that the Nefesh HaBahamis has a teva of Moyach shalta aleh means that a Yid doesn't want to do an Aveda until the Nefesh HaBahamis. I made this point repeatedly. It says in Chassidus, it says the same thing about a goy, and it comes to the Sheva Mitzvot of a goy. A Yid's Nefesh HaBahamis has no desire for an Aveda. Dvarim HaMutarim, permitted things, absolutely. Prohibited things, there's no desire. The animal soul doesn't want to do an Aveda. And Lahav Lagoy, when it comes to the Sheva Mitzvot, he has no desire to do an Aveda. And the explanation of this is really in chapter 24 in Tanya Perikov Dalit, where the Alter Rebbe brings the idea of Ufkudasa Yizbarech Shamra Rucham. I don't know if I told this to you last week. Tell me, I don't want to repeat myself. Ufkudasa Yizbarech Shamra Rucham means every creation was created with a pkuda, with a memory, with a purpose, with a teva, and they cannot violate that nature. And the proof that the Alter Rebbe brings is Daniel is thrown into a pen full of hungry lions, but Daniel has a tzelem alakim, and they can't touch him. And the Rebbe tries to impress, that's not a nes. That's the teva of a balchai. An animal's a tativ, a datus has a limit, And if Kudasei Shamra Ruche, whatever teva the Eibishter gave him, they cannot violate. What's considered the lowest of the animals? The lowest of the animals is the yitush, the gnat, the mosquito. That's a machnes ve'ein ma'iti that takes in, doesn't give out. And the Alter Rebbe asserts that even this lowly creature that doesn't even give waste, don't even give away waste, he's so selfish, he doesn't even want to give away waste, has a teva that he can't violate. A human being, a Jew and lahavla non-Jew, also has a teva. What's the teva? I'm talking about animal soul now. Dvarim amutarim, farvos nit. Permitted things, he wants to indulge, he's an animal. Prohibited things, it's against his teva, it's against the nature of his nefesh habahamis. So then comes the kasha, how does the Yid do an Aveda? How does the Goy Lahavdul transgress, violate one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Neach? And the answer that's brought in the Tanya is Ruach Shtus. Animals don't have a Ruach Shtus. Animals have only a Teva. And therefore that never changes. Whatever the Eidim Shneidim to meet, they are. Even if they're terrible, they're they're carnivorous. And they're bloodthirsty. They have a containment. They have a medida of agbola. They have a limitation and don't violate it. Human beings also have a teva, but human beings can violate that teva, can transgress that teva, and cross over a line. And then it says in the Chassidus that the Yitush Kodmach, the mosquito, is better than a Yid, and all the other things that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya chapter 24, because the Yid has gone against his nature, the nature of his animal soul. So the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Me'ach Shalta Alev B'Tudasi V'Teva Yitzirase means that the Teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis is he cannot sin. That's the first way the Beinoni controls himself all day long, because of the Teva of his Nefesh HaBahamis. But then there's the other idea, and that's the Teva of the Nefesh HaLakis. What's the Chap over here? The Chap over here is the Teva of Nefesh HaLakis is Yechida. Yechida is ready for Mesilas Nefesh. What if the Mesilas Nefesh is hidden? The Yechid is hidden. The idea of Mesilas Nefesh, I can't become a Yid, neither wishes to nor is capable of becoming separate from the Eibishter. A Yid neither wishes to nor is able to become separated from the Eibishter. This is the Teva. So when it comes out in times of Mesilas Nefesh, the Yid becomes the biggest fanatic in the world. But at other times, when this, quote, Teva is covered over, so there's something called Ava Mesuteres. Or in the language of the Tanya, Kadosh Baruch Hu Ezrei. The idea that I have a fight between my Yitzhak and my Yetzer Hara, and my Yetzer Tov wins, because Hashem helps me, that help from Hashem is the Teva, it's the Teva of the Chochmah Shabbat, it's the Teva of the Nefesh HaLakis, if you remember the class I gave you 2 weeks ago, when it's in a state of Katnos. So what I'm doing now is I'm playing with words just to make it poetic. The Alter Rebbe says, when a Beinoni is off, not when a Beinoni is on, Madregas HaBeinoni is not Melech, he's Moshel. How does he win against Yetzer Hara? There's two in Yonim of Teva. First there's the Teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis Me'ach Shalta Lalev. Then there's the Teva of Nefesh HaLakis when it comes to Yonim of Kedusha. So this is reasonable, this is unreasonable, this is light and this is darkness, this is fake and this is real and this is fake. And what causes him to win is the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Teva of the Neshama. This is more or less what we learned. And on that basis, the Alter Rebbe says that Hirur Havera, the idea that a thought emerges from the subconscious to the consciousness of a Beinoni, and is not a sin. It's not Hirur Havera is not an Avera. Hirur Havera is Koshem Avera. It could bring to Averas, but Hirur Havera is not a sin. Says the Rebbe, the subconscious of the neshama will never bring to your consciousness a thought of doing an Avera. Just thinking about it, because the thought of doing an Avera is an Avera, you see. This is the point. This is the point that I'm repeating, Pashut, that when the subconscious brings to the consciousness a fantasy, that fantasy is not an Avera. Why? It's only an Avera if you continue to think it, or if you think about it practically. So the Alter Rebbe indicates, he says, in effect, that your Pnimius HaNeshama, a person who's a Beinoni, a person who is a Beinoni, it's not possible that his subconscious will give him a Hirur Avera, which is not an Avera but terrible, that has in it a practical component. Because a practical component would be itself an Avera. And again, based on the constant of the way we learn in this Pedic, the Teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis doesn't want it. Okay, was I clear? I mean, that's a little bit esoteric, a little bit vague. So let's read. So we'll do this quick, okay? We'll start again. Second line from the top of the page. And we're going to do this quickly. Maybe we'll finish even the Pedic today, okay? Second line from the top of page 34. Ella. Shebedvar Isur. That when it comes to something which is an Aveda, it doesn't even enter into his mind to do it. In other words, when the subconscious throws a thought to his consciousness, which is not an appropriate thought, so we know that that's not an Aveda because you have no control over it. So the Alter Rebbe adds, and it will never be a practical thought, because the practical fantasy would constitute an Aveda, and it's against the Teva for that to occur. It does not rise up into his awareness. To do the Aveda, actually, God forbid, we're going to translate it in a fantasy. And the fantasy, not mamish. If it will be a davar muter, permitted things, he can think about doing it. But if it will be about davar asur, a thing which is prohibited, he will never think about those. To just think the fantasy alone. That the Gemara says, fantasies about sin are harder than the Aveda itself. Says that Rabbi it's possible for his nefesh, for his subconscious, to influence, to ascend into his mind, and to entangle him and to confuse him. Aveda from learning and davening. The Gemara says, Gimel Avedas, there are 3 sins that ein adam nitzel mehem b'chol yom, a person is never spared. The first one is heated Aveda, the fantasy of an Aveda. The second one is iyun tefillah, is examination, kavana during davening. And the third is avak lashon hara. Right? Now I told this to you last week, that the Rebbe says, this is a great diplomatic term, the Rebbe indicated, he didn't say, he indicated, in Tanya Perek Chav Hey, that when the Gemara says, Shalosh Avedas ein adam nitzum hem b'chol yom, it doesn't mean Avedas. Because if there's 3 Avedas that a person does every single day, then there can't possibly be a Beinani. A Beinani has no Avedas. So Shalosh Avedas ein adam nitzum b'chol yom, you have a Lashon and Tanya. Can I bother you for that chitas for a second, if you don't mind? I'll read you the wording. This is from Tanya chapter 25, Perek Chav Hey, where he's talking about the Indian of mitzvahs being l'maylam and azman and coming into zman. I'm just going to read you a few words, and I think that those few words belong to us as well. It says, "Chishe'esek b'dvarim b'teilim lagamri." One is engaged in words and things which are batel lagamri. What's the taich batel lagamri? She'ein be'em tzedek klal la'avedas Hashem. They have no benefit in avedas Hashem. Now, in none of these words does it say Aveda. It simply says, Dvarim b'teilim lagamri, she'ein bahem tzedek klal la'avedas Hashem. Okay? And this line, that a person is involved in things that ein bahem tzedek la'avedas Hashem klal, is connected to this Gemara of ein adam nitzel mimenu b'kol yom. So the Rebbe here in page Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph in Perek Chav Hey suggests that when the Gemara says Shalosh Avedas ein adam nitzel b'chol yom, doesn't mean Avedas. It means Dvarim b'teilim lagamri she'ein be'em tzedek klal Avedas Hashem, and that's what he means over here. Okay, that's what he means over here. That the Shalosh Avedas, the ein adam nitzel b'chol yom, is not mamish Avedas, but it's Dvarim b'teilim lagamri she'ein be'em tzedek Avedas Hashem klal. Now last week I gave you a little bit of a discussion on iyun tefillah. And we're going to move on. Raket is only. Shalazeh. Then when you get these fantasies from the subconscious to the consciousness. So if there would be Dvarim HaMutarim, the fantasy would come along with a practical component. If it's Dvarim HaAsurim, the fantasy does not come along with the practical component. It's just a fantasy. And Lazeh Me'il, for this it's enough. Harashimu B'meichin, the trace which is in one's mind. Yiras Hashem, the fear of God. V'avos Yamusu Teres, and his hidden love. B'chol Allah Yimar, in the left ventricle of his heart. In other words, what we call avativis, the love of the neshama, the way it's in a state of katnos, lehis gaber, to strengthen oneself. V'lish leit al razeh, to dominate this evil, hamisave taive, that desires a weakness. That's why I touched the word taive, a weakness. Shalei li yes lei, that the person shouldn't have, that the Yitzhahara from the shouldn't have, shlito memshala, dominance and a rule, be'ir, over the city, to bring forward his weakness, his desire for weakness. For potential to actual to go into the limbs of the body. So the person is not in the middle of davening, he's after davening, he's not in a state of melech, he's in a state of shlita and memshala. Why? So the Yetzer Hara gives him fantasies, the Yetzer Hara can't give him practical thoughts of it, just fantasies, and he's able to push it out using this teva of Ave Misuteres and the teva of Meach Shaltalev. We read on. Va'afilu b'meach levadi. Even in one's mind alone. Laharer bera, to think a bad thought. And again, the word hidur of him means a fantasy. And contextually, the difference, I think, between the word hidur and the word machshava. Machshava means to plan something, to plan to do it. Hidur still means a fantasy. So, when you have machshava, thinking about doing an aveda is an aveda. Hidur means a fantasy which is not practical. So he continues, even hidur, ein leishlito memshala. The nefesh habahamis does not have sufficient control. Lecharer chas v'shalom, to think this fantasy, b'ritzeinei shabameach, willfully in one's mind. In other words, she'kabel b'ratzon chas v'shalom hidur zehara, that one should willfully accept, embrace this fantasy which is evil, ha'ela me'ela, which is happening subconsciously, uncontrollably, me'aleh from the heart, l'meach to the mind, as we discussed before. So when this fantasy, which is not correct, enters into a person's mind, so he couldn't control the fantasy, he pushes it out right away. So there's two things, there's hirur and there's machshava. In hirur, there's the way the fantasy enters and the way the fantasy is entertained. When the fantasy enters, you have no control over that. So the Alter Rebbe says you'll never have a practical fantasy because that would constitute an aveda in itself, and you're no teva for an aveda. The perpetuation, enjoying that fantasy, would constitute an aveda, and thinking about it practically would also constitute an aveda. So the Alter Rebbe says, Ella, rather, miyad ba'aleyosei l'shav. The moment the fantasy enters into the consciousness of the person, and the person becomes aware that this fantasy has entered into his consciousness, he proverbially, he spiritually pushes it out with both hands, and he distracts daite, his awareness, miyad, immediately from this fantasy. Miyad the moment he realizes that it's an inappropriate fantasy, it's not accepted willfully, even to let himself just think about it in an imaginary way. And certainly to allow it to enter and to remain in his awareness on a level of action. And again, we're going to assume that the level of action, we would not use the word hirur anymore. We would use the word machshava, because that also would constitute an aveda. Or yafil l'daber, even to speak about it. Just like it's considered a sin to think about doing an aveda, it's considered a sin to perpetuate a fantasy. Someone who has a fantasy willfully, Niki Rasha Beis Hashos, the Rasha at that hour, Vahabeinani, and the Beinani, Eine Rasha, is not a Rasha, Afil Shah Achas, even for 1 hour, Leilam forever. So did I teach you anything new? Not mamish. I really didn't teach you anything new. I simply reviewed what we learned, maybe I added a little bit, but I didn't teach you anything new. Okay, so now I need to make a confession. A serious confession. A very, very hard to make confession. I teach Bochrim, Baruch Hashem. And one of the greatest nachas a teacher can have, as the Nebuchadnezzar says to the teacher, Rebbe, I don't understand. I saw in the Rebbe's Sikha different than you said. And I say, show me. And he opens it up and he shows me, and I was 100% incorrect. Wow. So I have been on a soapbox for weeks now, and I'm it wrong. So I finished teaching you the wrong until now. Today's shiur was also based on that wrong. Now I want to correct my wrong. Now, why don't I know about this?
1 minute, but why, if you know that it's wrong, did you do this to us?
I didn't. I just found out. Just a Thursday morning, okay. This morning I finished the shiur, and now I'm going to tell you because I want to make sure that the correction is absolutely clear. I'm to be equivocal.
Okay.
The reason I made a mistake is because it's a note from the Rebbe in the next Perek. It's not here. It's in Perek Yud Gimel. So I said to this Bocher, it's really... I'm not embarrassed to admit I'm wrong. I should have put it here and not just put it in the next Perek. And I'll tell you what the mistake is. I want to be very clear about it. Okay? Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. a person, we're talking about Madregas HaBeinani, right? I'll give you the regular Sunday morning introduction. We're talking about Madregas HaBeinani. Madregas HaBeinani is a high level. Madregas HaBeinani is not someone who does a Beinani, but someone who is a Beinani. What's the code words for Madregas HaBeinani? Meluch and Memshala, right? Melech and Moshe. That's how it always works. Melech and Moshe. Meluch and Memshala. What's Melech? When a Beinani davens, when a Beinani is in an inspired state, he's sleeping. The Alter Rebbe mentions the idea of Eshas HaKosher, Eis Ratzon, it only works at certain times, yes? The rest of the day, the belly is only a shalit. Where does he get his keich from Shlita from? So there's 2 points. Number 1, Meich Shalta Alev, and number 2, Ubefrat Al Tzad HaKedush. That when a person is facing a shaila of doing the right thing or the wrong thing, it's like light and darkness. Light and darkness never had any fights. Light and darkness don't have any fights. Yeah? So these are 2 different ideas. Now, how did I explain it to you? And this part isn't incorrect. This part is incorrect. What's the difference between the first idea of Teva, of Meich Shalta Alev, and the second idea, Ubefrat Tzad HaKedusha? When you see light and darkness, you don't really have a choice. The difference is that the first one is the Nefesh HaBahamis, and the second is the Nefesh HaLakis. The Nefesh HaBahamis, by a Beinani, has a Teva, right? Just like an animal cannot violate its nature and be worse than the Eibushter made him to be, the Nefesh HaBahamis of a Yid has a nature, and it can't be worse than the Eibushter made him to be, B'Teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis. And of course, one of the things that I love to point out, as the Rebbe says, this is true of a Goy. The Teva of a Goy is that he cannot be Eir on the Sheva Mitzvahs B'Nenech. And the Rebbe writes for Fedish, the only way a Goy doesn't have Eir, the same thing as by a Yid, is the Ruach Shtus. Not because the Eibushter said don't do it, because it's against the Teva of his Nefesh HaBahamis. Yes? So there's 2 ideas. Number 1, the Teva of my Nefesh HaBahamis can't do an Aveda. Number 2, when I see the light of godliness, it's black and white. It's unequivocal. So where's my mistake? My mistake is that I told you that the first idea of Teva is from the Nefesh HaBahamis alone. The second idea of the light of the neshama being stronger, light being stronger than darkness, the Alter Rebbe says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ezi, and the help of the Eibishter. So my mistake is as follows. The Rebbe says in the next Perek, in chapter 13, and again, I'm not making excuses and I'm not blaming anybody, but it's very important for me to make this very, very clear. The Alter Rebbe says, the 2 ideas that a Beinani who is not davening sustains the level of Beinani, both have an outside support. Both, not just one. The first idea of Moyach Shalta Alev, the first idea of Moyach Shalta Alev, which is for the Nefesh HaBahamis, the Rebbe says the assistant for that is what remains from the davening before. Harashimu Shanishar from the davening. The second idea, that when a Jew sees light against darkness, good and evil are really not 2 forces. They're a thing and an anti-thing and a non-thing. When you see the reality of light against darkness, you don't really have a choice. And you choose light. Over there, the Alter Rebbe said that you have help from the Chochmah Shebenefesh, from the Pintel Yid. Yeah. So this is the correction. The correction is that a Yid is not inspired. He's in the Beinani, Madregas HaBeinani is in an uninspired state. There are 2 ways he sustains the level of Bein. There's 2 ways he wins. Each one has help. Number 1, Moyach Shalta Alev B'Teva, that the Nefesh HaBahamis' Teva is enough, is because the davening you did in the morning supports you. Number 2, the idea that the Nefesh HaLakis, when it's completely hidden, the Pintel, it's completely hidden. When you see light and you see darkness, you choose light and you don't choose darkness. You choose what makes sense and you don't choose what's foolish. This has to do with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that Hashem helps us, and the idea that Hashem helps us comes from the Pintel Yid, from the Pnimius HaNefesh. In other words, from the Teva of the Nefesh HaLakis. This is the correction.
Didn't you say that?
You said
the
that
second one before.
The second one I said before, but the first one I didn't.
You didn't say that the Eibushter helped.
I said exactly the opposite. I brought out the point
Only that.
but you see, what the Rebbe says, it's not the Eibushter helps. It's your davening that helps.
Okay.
The first one, Meich Shalta Alev B'Teva, the Nefesh HaBahamis, Haroy Shemenish B'Chalayay. The second one, that you're able to win your Yetzer Hara when you're not inspired, because when you see light and darkness, you don't have a choice. This is like HaKadosh Baruch Hu way. This comes from the neshama, from the teva of the Pintel Yid. I dafke finish the shtickle, and sustain the mistake. I just want to be very, very clear that the Rebbe says that the teva of the and the truth of the matter is I don't understand it. Because if you learn Tanya, Pedek Ches, you could actually make the argument. What happened was, I gave a shir to the Bachrim in Zal. And one of the Bachrim says to me, wait, the Rebbe says different. So of course I jumped at him, where does the Rebbe say different? And he opened up the book and he showed me. I was so disappointed, because I'm so into this whole idea of Teva. So another mashpia says to me, wait, he's trying to defend me. He said, no, so the Rebbe says avart, but it doesn't mean necessarily. Because the truth of the matter is, if you understand what the Rebbe says in Perek Ches, it's such an interest, it's such a yesodistic thing. It's a yesodistic thing as a person to understand that Hashem made us with no proclivity for sin. It's a point that the Rebbe makes in Tanya. Why is an Aveda Ruach Shtus? Why is doing an Aveda considered a foolishness, a Ruach Shtus? Because it's against your nature. Not your nature of your neshama, it's against your nature of your nefesh habahamis. So l'chayra, you could say that it's from the nature alone. And the Rebbe says, no, it's not enough. If a person listens to the nature of his nefesh habahamis, not to do an Aveda, it's because there's a roishim left from Avodas Hatfil. So one of the other mashpiyim who happened to sit in the zal, listen to Mashiach, says, maybe, yeah, it's nishka stira. To me, it is a stira. In the next Perek, the Rebbe is going to say that this idea of the teva of the nefesh habahamis being enough to not do an aveda is because you daven in the morning. So I'm sharing that. I hope I'm being very clear and very direct about it. So when you look inside, when you look inside, and it says, we're on page, what page are we on? We're on page 34, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines from the top. It says, what does this mean? I think that in these words, you have two things. You have both. You have the fact that I davened. Means what? A trace of something that I did before. That's the davening. And when it says that's talking about the second thing. That's talking about Dinyan HaTeva. And that's what I'm thinking. Anyway, let's finish the page. Somebody wants to say something, you're free to speak.
I just want to make sure that I'm translating something correctly. When we say that a person has bchira, this Beinoni has bchira, let's say, what does that mean? He has help, but like, what's his chance? Why is he doing an Aveda?
Ruach Shtus. Where does the Ruach Shtus come from?
Yeah.
So it says in Kurtus Amayan, from Riboy Hishtakus in Dvar Mamutarim. That's what the Alter Rebbe says.
I need English.
That when a person enjoys material things that are permitted a lot, they lose their chush for ruchnis, and that sets up the possibility to cross over from a permitted thing to a prohibited thing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called Ruach Shtus.
Okay.